Democratic Senator Tammy Baldwin is here as well. Senator Baldwin, thanks so much for your time. We appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
So let's start in Minneapolis. From what you have seen and what you've learned this week, do you believe that the shooting by a federal ICE agent was justified?
Look, what we saw in the killing of a young mother was a tragedy. And we also saw a lot of people in the administration prejudge, misinform, and create a narrative consistent with their own views on that. And that's really beneath the dignity of the offices that they hold. What has to happen is a thorough investigation by law enforcement, local law enforcement, and to bring the transparency and justice that Minnesotans deserve in this case. But I have to be honest with you, the Trump administration sending thousands of masked armed agents into neighborhoods across the country and into neighborhoods in Minnesota is only increasing tensions, not decreasing tensions. It's only bringing disruption rather than de-escalating. And if they stuck to what Donald Trump said they would be doing, which is going after hardened, violent criminals, that would be for the good. But right now they are roaming schools and neighborhoods, residential neighborhoods, and that is escalating tensions, not bringing them down.
Yeah, do you have confidence that there can be an independent, fair, and thorough investigation given the DHS's comments so far, some of the comments from the administration already laying out the narrative of what happened last week?
Look, it is irresponsible for them to misinform the public and create a narrative that aligns with their own thinking on these issues. We need Minnesota law enforcement to do a full investigation. Minnesotans deserve transparency, they deserve justice, and they deserve an outside look at what happened.
When the mayor of Minneapolis says things like, quote, get the expletive out, referring to ICE, is that appropriate?
Look, I can understand emotions are running high in terms of the language, but the bottom line, as I just described, is that ICE's presence in these cities in large numbers, masking themselves, armed agents roaming cities, residential neighborhoods, school grounds, they are causing chaos. And that is not keeping our communities safe. If they stuck to what they're supposed to be doing, which is what Donald Trump said they would do, which is going after hardened, violent criminals, they would have community support. But the idea of them grabbing families off the street and so on is not keeping our communities safe. In fact, it's making them, as we saw in Minnesota, sadly this week, more dangerous.
I want to ask about Venezuela. You've spoken out against how U.S. forces captured Maduro. I know you voted for the War Powers Resolution this past week as well. Why shouldn't the president have power to use military force?
The president clearly has the power to use military force when we are in imminent danger and our national security is on the line. But the president has made it very clear after storming into Venezuela that his objective was about oil, that he wanted to secure Venezuelan oil resources for his big oil buddies. We need a president who is focused on bringing down costs in the United States for hardworking families. That's what he said he would do. But instead, he is distracted by invading Venezuela. He's talking about invading Greenland, Colombia, Cuba. He's talking about building ballrooms. He's talking about all sorts of things and not focusing in on the thing that working Wisconsinites want him focused on and what he promised he would do on day one, which is bringing down costs.
Should Maduro, though, have been allowed to continue governing for as long as he sees fit, funneling tons of cocaine into the United States, according to prosecutors?
Look, there is a justice system for dealing with these issues. Maduro was under indictment. But we cannot have a world where one country says, I don't want, wants to interfere with the leadership of a neighboring country. What if China did this with Taiwan? What if India did this with Nepal? I mean, this is not the precedent for global peace that we need. This president came into office saying, I am going to end conflicts on day one. And instead, we see him creating a new one. But remember, the president, within hours of this military operation, said that he was going to run Venezuela and that he was going to take over their oil resources. I think he has been very clear about what his motive was in invading Venezuela on this military mission.
What's next for U.S.-Venezuela relations?
Look, right now, the president has been pretty clear about his intentions. He said this week that he will run Venezuela, that he will see if there needs to be troops on the ground. The American people did not ask for their sons and daughters to be involved in what could be another forever war. The American people are expecting something very different from this president, and that is to look at our domestic situation and bring down costs. And instead, we've seen at every turn President Trump back policies, whether it's tariffs or focus on issues that are bringing costs up for Americans, not bringing them down.
The president also mentioned other countries as well in the past week. You mentioned Greenland. What if the U.S. attempted to buy Greenland instead of using military force? Is there any scenario in which you would support that?
Look, there are bilateral negotiations that happen all the time, and there's no reason why we should not be in open dialogue with all of our allies and, frankly, our adversaries, because diplomacy is very important. And trade is very important. But I just want to, before getting too much in the weeds, or I guess in Greenland into the ice, I do want to say that we have a long-term presence in Greenland that dates back to pre-World War II days. And there are treaties and agreements in place that allow us to have a conversation about our security needs and theirs. But I certainly think this saber rattling that the president is doing about military takeover of Colombia, of Cuba, of Greenland, as well as running Venezuela, is getting him way off course in terms of what Americans elected him to do.
And you would be okay, though, having the conversation about purchasing, in this case, Greenland?
Look, we need to talk to our neighbors. We need to talk to our allies. It may be a non-starter, and then we'll find out. But my goodness, this is such a distraction for this president from what he ought to be looking at, which is the affordability for American people of their health care, their child care, their groceries, their energy bills. He's doing everything he can to make it worse rather than make it better.
Senator Tammy Baldwin, thanks so much for being here and for your time. We appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.